The Cartographer's Winter, A Slow World's Bedtime Story. Part 1. The Last Road North. The snow began falling 3 hours before Elina reached the cabin. At first it was gentle, fat, lazy flakes drifting down from a sky the colour of old wool, melting on the shoulders of her coat and catching in her hair. She walked steadily along the coastal path, her pack heavy with supplies, her boots finding purchase on ground that was still more mud than ice. The sea was a grey presence to her left, muttering against the rocks below the cliffs. By the second hour, the flakes had thickened. They fell faster now, swirling in gusts that came off the water, beginning to accumulate on the grass and stone. Elina pulled her scarf higher and kept walking. She had made this journey before, years ago. She knew the path would hold. By the third hour, the world had become a study in white and grey. The path was a suggestion beneath the snow, the cliff tops invisible, the sea reduced to sound alone, the distant rhythm of waves, muffled and strange. Elina walked by memory and by the feel of the ground beneath her feet, trusting that the cabin would appear when it was meant to. And then it did. A dark shape in the whiteness, a low roof heavy with snow, a chimney cold and waiting, stone walls the colour of charcoal built by hands that had understood this coast and its winters. The cabin sat in a small hollow where the cliffs curved inward, sheltered from the worst of the wind, facing a cove she could not see but could hear, the particular echo of waves against enclosed stone. Elina stopped and looked at it for a long moment, snow settling on her shoulders and her pack and the loose strands of grey hair that had escaped her hood. She was 53 years old. She had been a cartographer for 31 of those years. She had mapped coastlines on 4 continents, surveyed islands that had no names, drawn the shapes of harbours that had since been swallowed by the sea. Now she was here to draw them all again, one last time, from memory, to make something permanent from a life of wandering. She walked forward and opened the door. Part 2. The cabin. The interior was cold but dry, smelling of old wood and something faintly mineral, the salt that had seeped into everything over decades of coastal winters. Elina set down her pack and stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. A single room, perhaps 6 meters by 8. A fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean, a neat stack of firewood beside it. A bed occupied the corner opposite, a simple frame with a mattress that looked thick and surprisingly inviting. A table stood beneath the single window, its surface scarred by years of use, but solid, stable. A chair, a small kitchen area with a pump for water, a cast-iron stove, shelves holding basic supplies left by whoever had prepared the cabin for her arrival. It was modest. It was perfect. Elina began to unpack. First, the practical things. Dried food to supplement what was already here. Tea and coffee, a bottle of whiskey for the coldest nights. Warm clothes, a second pair of boots. Candles, though there were already plenty on the shelves. A small medical kit she hoped she wouldn't need. Then the important things. Her notebooks filled with decades of field observations. Her pens and ink, 3 bottles of black, 1 of sepia, 1 of deep blue for water. Her brushes. Her paper, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, and the leather case that held her most precious possession, a set of surveying instruments that had been her father's before her, brass and glass, worn smooth by generations of hands. She arranged her workspace on the table beneath the window, paper here, ink there, notebooks stacked within easy reach. The instruments she placed on a shelf above, where they could watch over her work like small mechanical guardians. Then she built a fire, The wood caught easily, flames licking up through the kindling, and within minutes the cabin began to warm. Elina sat on the floor before the hearth, still in her coat, and watched the fire grow. Outside, the snow continued to fall. She could hear it, a soft, constant whisper against the roof and walls, the sound of the world being gently buried. She was here. The winter had closed in behind her. For the next 4 months, there would be no leaving, no visitors, no demands except the ones she placed on herself. She felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been tight for longer than she could remember. She put the kettle on. Part 3. The first night. The sounds began after dark. Elina had eaten a simple dinner, soup made from dried vegetables, bread that was only slightly stale, cheese that she had carried from the village 3 days' walk to the south. She had washed her dishes, stoked the fire, and settled into the chair by the window with a cup of tea and one of her oldest notebooks, reviewing the surveys she had made as a young woman on the western archipelago. The snow had stopped. The clouds had thinned. Through the window she could see a few stars emerging, cold and bright, and the white landscape glowing faintly with reflected light. She was reading about a harbour she had mapped 30 years ago, trying to remember the exact curve of its northern breakwater, when she heard it. A soft scuffling beneath her feet. Elina went still, listening. The sound came again, something moving, shifting, settling. It was coming from below the floorboards, from the dark space between the cabin's wooden floor and the frozen earth beneath. She set down her notebook and her tea. She listened, more scuffling, a soft chittering sound, barely audible. Then silence. Elina waited for a long moment, but the sounds did not return. Eventually she picked up her notebook and continued reading, though part of her attention remained on the floor beneath her feet. Something was living under the cabin. She was not surprised. She had been told when she arranged this winter posting that the northern coast was home to creatures that denned during the cold months. The locals had a name for them that she had already forgotten, something in the old language, meaning snowtails or winter foxes or something of that nature. They were harmless, she had been assured. Shy. They would not bother her. She had not expected them to choose the space beneath her cabin for their winter home. She listened for a while longer, but the sounds did not return. Eventually she finished her tea, banked the fire, and went to bed. As she lay there in the darkness, the cabin creaking softly as it settled against the cold, she heard them again. Faint movements, a quiet purring that she felt more than heard, vibrating up through the floorboards and into the frame of her bed. She smiled in the darkness. She was not entirely alone, after all. Part 4. The work begins. Morning came grey and cold, the light filtering through the window like something diluted, uncertain of itself. Elina rose, rebuilt the fire, and made coffee strong enough to chase the chill from her bones. She stood by the window drinking it, looking out at the transformed world. The snow lay thick and undisturbed, covering everything in smooth white curves. The cove was visible now, a horseshoe of dark water enclosed by rocky arms, the waves small and quiet in the shelter of the cliffs. Beyond the cove, the open sea stretched to the horizon, grey and vast and empty. She watched a bird circle over the water, some kind of seabird, white against the grey sky. And she thought about the maps she had yet to draw. After breakfast, she began. The first coastline she chose was one she knew well, the southern shore of the Varen Peninsula, where she had spent 3 summers in her 20s, scrambling over rocks and wading through tide pools, measuring angles with her father's instruments and filling notebook after notebook with observations. She could still feel the particular quality of the light there, golden and hazy. and the smell of the salt grass that grew on the dunes. She closed her eyes and let the memory rise. Then she opened them, dipped her pen in ink, and began to draw. The work was slow and precise. Each line required consideration, not just accuracy, but beauty. A map was more than a record of geography. It was an invitation to imagine, a doorway into a place the viewer might never see. Elina had learned this from her father, who had learned it from his mother before him. Maps were stories, drawn in ink and contour, and the careful placement of names. She worked for 3 hours without stopping, the fire crackling softly behind her, the grey light from the window falling across her paper. When she finally set down her pen and stretched her aching fingers, she found that she had completed the basic outline of the peninsula's eastern coast. The long curve of the main shore, the jut of the 3 major headlands, the scatter of small islands that sheltered the fishing villages from the open sea. It was rough yet. It would need refinement, detail, the addition of depths and currents, and the names of places. But it was begun. She made more coffee and returned to work. Part 5. Neighbours Below. Over the following days, Elina learned the rhythms of her unseen neighbours. They were most active at night, when the cabin was dark and the fire had burned low. She would lie in bed and listen to them moving beneath her, the soft pad of feet on frozen earth, the occasional thump of a body turning over, the strange chittering conversations that seemed to pass between them. Sometimes she heard what sounded like play. Quick scuffling, a series of high-pitched yips, the thud of small bodies colliding. There were at least 4 of them, she estimated, perhaps 5. A family, she assumed, parents and young from the previous spring, denning together for warmth and safety. During the day they were silent, sleeping through the pale hours while she worked at her table. But as the light faded each afternoon, she would begin to hear them stirring. Soft sounds at first, then more movement, then the scratch of claws as they emerged from whatever passage they used to enter and exit their den. She never saw them leave. The entrance must have been on the far side of the cabin, away from her window. But sometimes, if she looked out at the right moment in the blue twilight, she would see their tracks in the snow, small, delicate prints leading away from the cabin towards the cliffs, where she assumed they hunted for whatever creatures remained active in the winter months. The tracks always came back by morning. On the 5th night, she saw one for the first time. She had risen to use the small privy at the back of the cabin, wrapping herself in a heavy blanket against the cold. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow across the floorboards. As she crossed the room, something caught her eye, a glint of light low to the ground. She stopped and looked. A knothole in the floor near the corner where the wall met the chimney, and in the knothole 2 eyes looking up at her. They caught the ember light and reflected it back, pale gold, curious, unafraid. Elina held her breath. The creature held her gaze for a long moment. 3 heartbeats, 4, and then it blinked and was gone, retreating into the darkness below. She stood there for a long time, wrapped in her blanket, staring at the empty knothole. Her heart was beating fast, though she couldn't have said whether from surprise or wonder. She had seen them now, one of them at least, and it had seen her. She went back to bed and dreamed of golden eyes in the darkness. Part 6. Deep Winter. December became January. The days grew shorter, then began to lengthen again, though the difference was imperceptible at first. Minutes of light gained back from the darkness, so gradual that she only noticed when she looked at her logbook and saw the changing times of sunset. The storms came in waves. 3 days of howling wind and horizontal snow, the cabin shuddering against the onslaught. the world beyond the window reduced to a blur of white. Then a day of calm, the sky clearing to reveal a hard blue ceiling above a landscape transformed. Then another storm, and another calm, the rhythm of the coast asserting itself regardless of her presence. Elina worked through it all. The Viran Peninsula was finished now, a complete survey of its coastline rendered in ink and watercolour, every headland and harbour and hidden cove recorded for posterity. She had moved on to the northern reaches, a stretch of shore she had mapped 15 years ago during a particularly difficult expedition. The memories of that time were less pleasant than her earlier surveys. Cold, constant rain, a fever that had nearly killed her. But the coastline itself had been beautiful, and she found herself rediscovering that beauty as she drew. The work sustained her. Each morning she woke with purpose. Each night she went to bed with the satisfaction of progress made. Her atlas was taking shape, page by page, coastline by coastline. A lifetime of wandering, slowly being rendered into something permanent. And through it all, the creatures beneath the floor kept her company. She had learned more about them now. She had learned that the young ones were bolder than the adults, more curious, more likely to peer up through the knothole when she was working at her table. She had learned that they purred when they were content, a low, rumbling vibration that she could feel through the floorboards when she sat very still. She had learned that they cached food somewhere in the snow near the cabin. She found their small hollows sometimes when she ventured outside to fetch more firewood. She had not seen another one clearly since that first night, but she felt their presence constantly. A warmth beneath the cold, a life beneath the stillness. It comforted her more than she had expected. On the longest night of the year, she left an offering outside the cabin door. Scraps of dried fish, a bit of cheese, a crust of bread. In the morning, the food was gone, and a single delicate feather lay in its place, long and silver white, tipped with pale blue. She kept the feather on her desk for the rest of the winter. Part 7. Glimpses. January faded into February, and Elina began to see them more often. Not clearly, never clearly, but in glimpses, in fragments, in the corner of her eye as she worked or rested or stared out the window at the endless white. A flash of silver fur disappearing around the corner of the cabin as she opened the door to fetch wood. A shape in the twilight, low and quick, moving across the snow toward the cliffs. The tip of a feathered tail, pale blue in the ember light, vanishing through the knothole just as she turned to look. They were getting used to her, she thought. Or perhaps she was getting used to them, learning to see them in the spaces between attention, the way one learns to see wildlife, only by not looking directly. She began to leave her offerings regularly now. Every few nights she would set out scraps near the cabin door, and every morning they would be gone, replaced sometimes by a feather, sometimes by a small stone, worn smooth by the sea, sometimes by nothing at all. She collected these gifts on the shelf above her desk, next to her father's instruments. One evening she saw two of them together. She had stepped outside to watch the sunset, a rare, clear evening, the sky turning from blue to gold to deep violet, the snow catching the colours and reflecting them back. She stood at the corner of the cabin, wrapped in her heaviest coat, breathing clouds into the cold air. Movement caught her eye. Down by the cove, where the rocks met the waterline, two shapes were picking their way along the shore. They moved with a fluid grace, their long feathered tails held high for balance, their silver-white fur almost invisible against the snow, except where it caught the fading light. Elina stood perfectly still and watched them. They were hunting, she realized. One of them had found something in a tide pool, a small creature of some kind, a crab or a shellfish, and the other was trying to steal it. They tussled briefly, more play than aggression, their movements quick and light. Then they separated, each finding their own pool to investigate, their heads dipping down toward the water, their tails swaying gently behind them. She watched until the light faded and they became invisible against the darkening shore. Then she went back inside and sat by the fire, her heart full of something she couldn't name. She was beginning to love them. Part 8. The Storm. The worst storm of the winter came in the 3rd week of February. Elina had sensed it coming, a pressure in the air, a restlessness in the creatures beneath the floor, the particular quality of silence that preceded violence. She had spent the day before securing everything she could, stacking extra firewood inside, filling every container with water in case the pump froze, checking the shutters on the window and the seal around the door. When the storm hit, it hit hard. The wind came first, a roar that built from nothing to overwhelming in the space of an hour, shaking the cabin on its foundations, finding every crack and gap and whistling through with malicious persistence. Then the snow, horizontal and blinding, turning the world beyond the window into a featureless, white void. Then the cold, a cold that crept in despite the fire, despite her heaviest blankets, despite everything she could do to keep it at bay. Elina sat by the fireplace and fed it wood, and tried not to think about what would happen if the supply ran out before the storm did. Below her, the creatures had gone silent. She could feel them, huddled together in their den, waiting out the violence just as she was. She found herself talking to them in her mind, sending reassurance downward through the floorboards. It's all right. We'll be all right. This will pass. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of howling darkness, of cold that bit through everything, of wind that seemed determined to tear the cabin apart, board by board. Elina slept in short bursts, waking to feed the fire, to check the walls for damage, to listen for any change in the endless roar. She did not work, could not work, her hands too stiff with cold, her concentration shattered by the constant noise. On the second night, she heard them moving beneath her. Not their usual movements, not the comfortable shuffling and settling of a family at rest. This was different, urgent. A series of high-pitched calls, distressed and repeated, answered by deeper sounds that might have been reassurance. Something was wrong. Elina knelt on the floor, pressing her ear to the boards. The sounds continued. The high calls, the deeper answers, a scrabbling that seemed to move back and forth beneath her. She thought of the young ones, the bold, curious young ones who had peered up at her through the knothole. Were they frightened? Were they hurt? There was nothing she could do. The storm raged on, and she could not reach them, could not help them, could not even see what was happening in the darkness below. She stayed there on the floor, listening until the sounds quieted. In the morning, the 3rd morning, the storm began to fade. The wind dropped from a roar to a howl to a moan to a whisper. The snow slowed, then stopped. The clouds broke, revealing a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Elina opened the door and stepped outside. The world had been remade. Snow lay in drifts taller than she was, sculpted by the wind into strange and beautiful shapes. The cabin was half buried, its walls disappearing into white slopes that curved up towards the roof. The cove was invisible, filled with snow, only the dark line of open water beyond the rocks, indicating where land ended and sea began. She waded through the drifts to the far side of the cabin, where she had never gone before, where she knew the creature's entrance must be. She found it, a dark gap beneath the foundation stones, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a rocky outcrop. The snow around it had been disturbed, paw prints, tail marks, the signs of repeated passage. And there, just outside the entrance, huddled against the cold stone, was a small body. Elina's heart seized. She knelt in the snow and reached for it. A young one. She could tell by the size, smaller than her forearm, the fur still soft and unmarked by age. It was cold. Too cold. Its eyes were closed. But as her hand touched it, the creature stirred. A weak movement, barely perceptible. A thin sound that might have been a cry. It was alive. Part 9. The Vigil. She brought it inside. She knew she probably shouldn't. Knew that wild creatures were best left to their own kind, that her intervention might do more harm than good. But she could not leave it there in the snow, dying slowly while its family huddled in the den below, and the cold crept in. She wrapped it in the softest cloth she had, a scarf that had belonged to her mother, and placed it in a box near the fire. Not too close, not too warm, just enough heat to coax the life back into its small body. Then she sat beside it and waited. The creature was beautiful, even in its weakness. Its fur was silver white like the adult's, but softer, finer, still carrying the fluffiness of youth. Its tail was shorter than she had expected, the feathers not yet fully grown, pale blue fading to white at the tips. Its paws were dark grey, the pads rough and textured for gripping ice and rock. Its breathing was shallow but steady. Its heartbeat, when she pressed her fingers gently to its chest, was fast but regular. She did not know what had happened. Perhaps it had gotten separated from the others during the storm, had tried to leave the den and been overwhelmed by the cold. Perhaps it had been sick already, weakened, unable to keep up with the rest. She would probably never know. She fed the fire and watched it breathe. By evening, it had begun to stir. Its eyes opened, golden like the one she had seen through the knothole, and it looked at her with an expression that might have been fear or confusion, or simply the blank incomprehension of a creature too young and too weak to understand what was happening. "It's all right," she said softly. "You're safe." The creature closed its eyes and slept again. She stayed with it through the night, dozing in her chair, waking every hour to check its breathing and feed the fire. By morning, it was stronger, lifting its head, looking around, making small sounds that might have been calls for its family. Below the floor, she heard answering sounds. The others knew. They could hear it, smell it, sense it somehow. They knew one of their own was here, above them, separated by wood and stone and the vast gulf between species. Elina made a decision. She carried the box to the knothole in the corner, the one where she had first seen golden eyes looking up at her. She set it down gently, angling it so that the young creature could see the gap in the floor, could see if its family came to look, the familiar shapes of its own kind. Then she retreated to the far side of the cabin and waited. It took hours. She worked at her desk, forcing herself to focus on the coastline she was drawing, the northern reaches, the stretch of shore where she had nearly died of fever, now taking shape in careful lines of ink. She did not look at the box. She did not look at the knothole. She worked and waited and trusted. In the late afternoon, she heard movement, soft sounds from beneath the floor approaching the knothole. A gentle chittering, the same sound the adults made, lower and more resonant than the young one's calls. Then silence. Then, very slowly, a shape rose into the knothole. An adult, larger than she had realized, its golden eyes fixed on the box. It stayed there for a long moment, motionless, watching. The young creature made a sound, a high, desperate cry, and the adult answered with a low rumble that Elina felt in her bones. She held her breath. The adult dropped back down into the darkness. For a terrible moment, she thought it had abandoned its young, decided the risk was too great, left the small creature to its fate. Then it returned, and this time it came all the way through. Part 10. The Crossing. It was larger than a fox, closer to the size of a small dog, its body long and lean, built for the cold. Its fur was denser than the young one's, silver-white with subtle markings of grey and pale blue that she hadn't been able to see before. Its tail was magnificent, long and feathered and flowing, the plumes catching the firelight as it moved. It crossed the floor in 3 quick bounds and stopped beside the box, its body tense, its eyes fixed on Elina. She did not move. She barely breathed. The adult looked at her for a long moment. Its gaze was intelligent, assessing, weighing the danger against the need. Elina tried to make herself small, unthreatening, just another piece of furniture in the cabin's familiar landscape. Then the adult bent its head and nuzzled the young one. The sound that passed between them was unlike anything Elina had heard before. A complex vocalization, part purr and part chirp, and part something else entirely, carrying meaning that she could not understand, but could feel. The young one responded, its voice stronger now, and the adult's tail wrapped around the box, around its child, claiming and protecting. Elina watched, tears streaming down her face, as the adult gently lifted the young one by the scruff of its neck. It paused at the knothole, the young one dangling from its jaws. It looked back at Elina one more time, a long, steady look that seemed to carry something. Gratitude, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement, one creature recognizing another. Then it dropped through the hole and was gone. Elina sat in her chair for a long time afterward, listening to the sounds of reunion beneath the floor, the chittering and purring, the high voices of the young ones greeting their returned sibling, the deeper tones of the adults moving and settling and being. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Part 11. Late Winter. March came softly, the days lengthening by minutes and then by half hours, the light taking on a quality that was less grey, more gold. The snow would remain for weeks yet, but it had begun to settle, to compact, to acquire the tired look of winter nearing its end. Elina's atlas was nearly complete. She had drawn 17 coastlines now, from the southern tropics to the frozen north. Each one was a piece of her life, rendered in ink and watercolor, a memory made permanent. The pages lay spread across her table, weighted down with stones and cups and the brass instruments that had guided her father's hand before her own. Looking at them, she felt something she had not expected. Satisfaction, yes, but also grief. This work had been her companion for months. When it was finished, what would she do? Who would she be? She pushed the thought aside and continued drawing. The creatures beneath the floor were more active now, emerging earlier each evening, returning later each morning. She heard them more often during the day, restless sounds, preparatory sounds, the stirring of animals who sensed that the season was turning and that soon they would need to be somewhere else. She saw them more often too, not just glimpses now, full sightings, sustained and unhurried. They had lost their fear of her, or perhaps they had simply decided that she was not a threat, not worth the energy of avoidance. She would look out her window and see them playing in the snow near the cove, chasing each other in great looping arcs, their feathered tails streaming behind them like banners. She would step outside to fetch wood and find one of them watching her from a nearby rock, its golden eyes calm, its body relaxed. The young one she had saved was among them. She was almost certain of it. One of the juveniles was bolder than the others, more likely to approach the cabin, more likely to meet her gaze and hold it. She liked to think it remembered her. She liked to think the warmth she had given it in the storm had left some trace. She left offerings every night now, and every morning she found gifts in return. Feathers, stones, once a shell that must have come from the beach, carried up the cliffs by small, determined paws. Her collection on the shelf had grown, a cabinet of curiosities assembled by creatures who could not know what they meant to her. She began to draw them. Not for the atlas. The atlas was coastlines, only coastlines, the work she had been assigned and the work she would complete. But in a separate notebook, in quiet moments between maps, she sketched what she saw. The curve of a tail, the set of an ear, the particular way they moved across the snow. She was not an artist of living things, had never trained for it, never practiced, but she wanted to remember them. She wanted some record of this winter, this cabin, this strange and unexpected companionship. The drawings were clumsy, but they were hers. Part 12. The Thaw. The first rain came in the second week of April. Elina heard it before she saw it, a different quality to the sound on the roof, softer than snow, more insistent. She went to the window and watched as the white landscape began to darken, pockmarked by drops that melted what they touched. It rained for 3 days. When it stopped, the world had changed. The snow remained in patches and drifts, but the ground was visible now. Dark earth, brown grass, the grey stone of the cliffs emerging from their winter burial. The cove was fuller, swollen with meltwater, its colour shifting from winter grey to something almost green, and the creatures were preparing to leave. She could hear it in their sounds, a new urgency, a restlessness that had nothing to do with hunting or play. They were moving things below her, rearranging their den, making ready. The young ones were almost fully grown now. She could no longer distinguish them from the adults by size alone, only by their behavior, their greater boldness, their tendency to linger near the cabin when the others had moved on. She had known this would come, had known from the beginning that they were winter denners, that the cabin was a temporary shelter, that spring would call them elsewhere. But knowing did not make it easier. On the last night, she sat by the window and watched them go. They emerged at dusk, one by one, from beneath the cabin. 5 of them, she had been right about the number. 2 adults and 3 young, their silver-white fur catching the fading light, their feathered tails held high. They gathered in a loose group near the cove, and for a long moment they simply stood there, looking back at the cabin, looking at her. Elina raised her hand, a small gesture probably meaningless to them. A human farewell to creatures who did not know what farewell meant. One of the young ones, the bold one, her one, she was almost certain, took a step toward the cabin. Its golden eyes met hers through the glass. It made a sound, a single soft chirp, and then turned and followed its family toward the cliffs. She watched until they disappeared into the twilight. Then she went back to her desk and finished the last coastline of her atlas. Part 13. Spring. The supply ship came in May, picking its way through the ice floes that still dotted the coastal waters. Elina heard it before she saw it, the drone of engines, foreign after months of wind and wave and silence. She had been ready for days. Her bags were packed. Her atlas was complete. Bound in leather she had brought for this purpose, the pages protected, the work of a lifetime made permanent and portable. The cabin was clean, the firewood restocked, the supplies replenished for whoever might come next. She stood at the door and looked at the room one last time. The shelf above her desk was empty now. She had taken the feathers, the stones, the shell, packed them carefully in cloth, and placed them in her bag. They would go with her wherever she went next. Small gifts from small creatures who had shared this winter with her without ever knowing what it meant. The knothole in the corner was just a knothole now. No golden eyes looked up from it. No sounds came from below. She closed the door behind her and walked down to the cove. The captain of the supply ship was a weathered man who had made this run for 20 years. He helped her aboard, asked polite questions about her winter, expressed appropriate amazement at the atlas she had produced. She answered as well as she could, though part of her was still in the cabin, still listening for sounds beneath the floor. As the ship pulled away from the cove, she stood at the stern and watched the coastline recede. The cabin grew smaller, then smaller still, until it was just a dark spot against the cliffs, barely visible. The cove became a curve in the shore, then a shadow, then nothing at all. She thought she saw movement on the rocks, a flash of silver white, a shape too quick to identify. But it might have been a trick of the light, a wave breaking, a bird taking flight. She chose to believe it was them. She chose to believe they had come to see her off. Part 14. The Return. 2 years later, Elina published her atlas. It was well received, praised for its accuracy, its beauty, its comprehensiveness. Scholars used it, sailors used it. Libraries acquired copies for their collections, and young cartographers studied its pages to learn how the craft was done. Elina accepted the accolades with grace, but they meant less to her than she had expected. The work had been its own reward. The winter had been its own reward. The recognition was pleasant, but distant, like applause for a performance she barely remembered giving. She was 60 now, and she had begun to think about the future. Not the future of her career. That was winding down, by choice and by nature. Not the future of the world, which would go on without her as it always had, but the future of her winters, the future of her solitude, the future of her remaining years, and where she wanted to spend them. She thought often about the cabin, about the fire and the fog and the sound of wind against the walls, about the scratch of pen on paper, the smell of ink, the satisfaction of work done well, about golden eyes in the darkness and feathered tails in the snow, and the particular quality of companionship that required no words. In the autumn of her 61st year, she wrote a letter to the coastal authority, requesting permission to return. They were surprised. Retired cartographers did not usually seek out isolated postings, but they granted her request. The cabin was empty, they said. No one had used it since her last stay. It was hers if she wanted it. She wanted it. She arrived in late November, just as the first snow began to fall. The path was as she remembered it. The cliffs, the cove, the cabin emerging from the grey like a homecoming. She opened the door and stepped inside. The room was cold but dry, smelling of wood and salt and memory. Her workspace was gone, packed up, shipped out, belonging now to libraries and scholars and people she would never meet. But the table was still there, and the chair, and the window looking out over the white world. She built a fire. As the flames rose and the cabin warmed, she heard a sound beneath the floor. A soft scuffling, a gentle purr. She smiled. She was home. Epilogue: The Notebook. From the personal notebook of Elina Voss, cartographer, found among her effects after her death at the age of 79. They came back every winter. I don't know if they were the same ones, the same family, grown and changed and having families of their own, or if they were different creatures who simply found the cabin to their liking. I like to think they remembered me. I like to think the young one I saved in the storm told its children about the strange, tall creature who lived above them, who left food by the door and never tried to harm them. I spent 12 more winters in that cabin. 12 winters of snow and silence and the sound of my neighbours beneath the floor. I drew no more coastlines. My atlas was complete, my life's work finished. But I drew them. Page after page, year after year, I drew their shapes and their movements in the particular way the light caught their feathered tails at dusk. Those drawings are not for publication. They are for me, and for whoever finds this notebook after I am gone. A record of something that mattered, even if I cannot explain why. I am writing this in what I suspect will be my last winter. My hands shake now, and my eyes are not what they were, and the walk from the bed to the fire has become a journey. But I am not unhappy. I have done what I came to do. I have made what I wanted to make. And I have shared my home with creatures who asked nothing of me except warmth and the occasional bit of dried fish. Tonight, when the light fades, I will sit by the window and watch for them. I will look for the flash of silver white in the snow, the glow of golden eyes in the darkness. I will listen for the purring beneath the floor, the sound of lives being lived in the spaces I cannot see. And when the time comes, when the fire goes out and does not relight, when the cold comes and I cannot push it back, I hope they will know. I hope they will understand, in whatever way their kind understands such things, that I was grateful, that I loved them, that these winters, these quiet winters, were the happiest of my life. The snow is falling now. I can hear them stirring below. Good night, small ones. Good night. The end.